The International Energy Agency, or IEA, is releasing 400 million barrels of oil into the global supply. It's an attempt to alleviate the oil market as Iran pummels Gulf energy infrastructure in response to the US-Israeli attacks. It's the largest release of oil in history. So, why are oil prices still rising? Sean Matthews, MEE journalist, is here to explain why the IEA release has not tamed markets. Sean, how do we make sense of this?
Thanks for having me on, Matilda. Yeah, it's really remarkable, and it shows just how much pressure the oil market is under. Brent crude, the international benchmark, it's up about 10% today, so it's topped $100 a barrel. And that really just signals that, even with this release, which you described perfectly right, it's the biggest release from the IEA member states in history, 400 million barrels. But given the fact that 20% of the world's crude and natural gas goes through the Strait of Hormuz, it's really just kind of putting a band-aid on this problem. So I think we just have to look at the numbers here. Basically, the release of 400 million barrels, if that actually is followed through, we should remember the agency hasn't said exactly when those barrels are going to hit the market. So that's one factor, whether they can get them rolling right away. But basically, that would just give the market about 30 to 40 days of supply that that is blocked right now because of Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So I think that's a really key point. The other thing that I would say is that the messaging from the Trump administration right now is really clear. After saying that they were going to escort tankers through the Strait of Hormuz, they've now backtracked. They've said that that's going to take maybe a month if they think they can still do it. And Iran, after this IEA release, they escalated and they basically hit two tankers in Iraqi waters, and they've also hit about 3 or 4 cargo vessels this week. So they are showing that they really do control the Strait of Hormuz. So again, this release is a band-aid. The market is showing that because it's up roughly 9-10% today. And basically the only way to get the price down is to reopen Hormuz.
Is there any way to get around the Strait of Hormuz when it comes to the oil supply? I mean, you recently published a deep dive for MEE about Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline. Tell us about that. Could that be a failsafe for the oil markets?
So this is really interesting, Matilda. Basically, what happened with this East-West pipeline, which runs from the Abqaiq oil field that Saudi Arabia has, basically on the Gulf Coast, the Persian Gulf. It goes through the Saudi desert, all the way across the country to the Red Sea, to the port of Yanbu, where Saudi Arabia has an export facility. That was built basically in the early 1980s. People who know Middle Eastern history will know at the time there was a brutal war between Iran and Iraq. And there were serious concerns that the Islamic Republic, then in its early years, would close the Strait of Hormuz and block exports through the Persian Gulf. So that's why this pipeline was built. It literally is built to make Saudi Arabia the oil producer of last resort. One analyst told me basically they have to swing that pipeline into work basically at times like this, right? A real global crisis in the energy market. So the Saudis are doing that. It's not a fail-safe. It gives the energy market something, but not a lot. So basically, the Saudis have said that they can export 7 million barrels per day through this pipeline. About 2 million barrels per day of that is going to go for Saudi's own domestic needs. So that leaves about 5 million barrels per day going through the pipeline and getting exported out. Of that, basically the port of Yanbu can only handle maybe 4 million barrels per day, 4.5 million barrels per day. So again, not a fail-safe. Just for comparison's sake, Saudi Arabia's oil exports in 2025, on average, we were looking at about like ballpark 7 million barrels per day. So there's still a drop. Obviously, it accounts for a big chunk of Saudi's exports, but it's not going to take the place of countries like Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, that are sealed off from markets. I should add that there's also a smaller Emirati pipeline that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz and goes to Fujairah, the port of Fujairah. That has also gone into action,
Yeah.
and about 2 million barrels per day is pumping through there, a little bit more. But again, that's not going to replace the gap that's left from the Strait of Hormuz closure. So the market's looking at about 11 to 12 million barrels per day, a shortfall basically with Hormuz being closed, even with the Saudi pipeline working and the Emirati pipeline working. The
Okay.
other thing I should say, Matilda, and we discussed in our article, is that now that everyone is focused on the port of Yanbu and we have all these tankers basically making a beeline from the Indian Ocean, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and up to the Red Sea. This puts the Houthis back in play. The Houthis, after Hamas's 7 October 2023 attack, they demonstrated an ability to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So all these vessels that are going to be taking oil at Yanbu on the Red Sea, they're going to have to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb in order to bring that oil to markets in India, Japan, South Korea, and China. So if the Houthis wanted to, they could attempt to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and that would really inflict a devastating loss on the market.
Yes, that would certainly be a significant turn if the Houthis came into play in this regional conflict. Another question I have is whether the release of crude alone can address the real world economic impacts of this war in the form of higher inflation. What are your thoughts on that?
So that's a really good question, Matilda, and I think this is what viewers of Middle East Eye and just ordinary people are going to feel massively. So we spoke with one energy analyst yesterday or this week who was saying that the big issue is not simply crude, it's the refined products that come out of that. So diesel and jet fuel especially. There's a big shortage of that on the market right now, and if you look at the difference between basically a price for a barrel of crude oil and a price for a barrel of jet fuel, it's almost double if you look at the price for jet fuel. And that's basically saying that even with all this crude that's being released, there aren't the refineries available to process that into the products that people actually buy, right? All those refineries are on the Persian Gulf Coast. So they're in Kuwait, they're in Bahrain, UAE, Iraq, and the Strait of Hormuz closure basically makes them sealed off. So it's like taking all those refineries out. Exactly, the U.S. and its allies can release as much oil as they want, but you need the refineries to process that into the refined products that consumers actually buy, and the release is not going to address that.
Now, Iran's approach here of trying to hurt America by attacking its Gulf allies, that is putting the Gulf states in a really difficult situation. And last year, US President Donald Trump appeared to be investing pretty hard in US relations with particularly the wealthiest of the Gulf states. How is this war looking to affect those relations?
It's just a real heavy blow, for the Gulf states. We did a story in the first week of the war saying that the Gulf states had already exhausted really their supplies of ballistic missile and drone interceptors, basically Patriot air defense systems and their THAAD air defense systems that they rely on for the U.S. And the U.S. was basically stonewalling their requests to replenish those interceptors. Not because the U.S. doesn't want to do it, but it simply doesn't have the arsenal to do it, right? They're extremely low. So in the Gulf, there is deep frustration, is what I hear from Gulf officials that I speak with, that the U.S. kind of started this war without bothering to stock up its allies at the very least. But of course, we know that the Gulf states, from Saudi Arabia to Qatar, even the UAE, they were lobbying against this conflict. They did not want a unilateral U.S.-Israeli strike on Iran, for the very fear of what is happening today, right? To see their energy installations struck, their city states, hit by missiles and drones. So they were warning the administration about this, and basically their pleas went unheeded. There've also been some reports that not only is the U.S. not refilling the interceptors for the Gulf states, but it has been prioritizing the defense of Israel over them.
Right.
We saw some Saudi commentators kind of lamenting this feeling of abandonment. And I can say that, again, across the Gulf, multiple countries in the Gulf that I have spoken with, regional officials and diplomats, that feeling of abandonment is very clear. And I think we've heard that expressed by former officials and even business leaders in the UAE who've written an open letter to President Donald Trump saying that the Gulf was not consulted on this war. They've been dragged into it. So a deep sense of abandonment, I think.
Thank you for laying that out. Now, on MEELive today, we have talked about attacks on energy infrastructure. We've also talked about attacks on water infrastructure. I'm just wondering, besides energy, besides water, what critical infrastructure could come into the firing line?
So Matilda, what we're seeing from Iran, and we've covered this extensively, is kind of this escalation ladder. Experts are telling us that Iran has not fired at everything that they can fire at. So things that are still on the works basically would be, electrical infrastructure. The other day, President Donald Trump threatened to take out basically the Iranian, grid to plunge it into darkness. And we saw a response from Iranian officials saying that if they do that, then that would make, all the electrical kind of grids in the Gulf region targets, given Iran's ability to really pinpoint strikes on U.S. Bases, American embassies, and as your previous guest was saying, desalination plants. The Iranian, kind of warning has to be taken seriously that they would do that as an escalation. I think the other thing that's not getting enough mention, which we talked about in previous reporting of ours, is the fact that the closure of Hormuz, it's not just impacting energy prices. And of course, the desalination plants are just one element of food security that's being impacted. So there are rising food prices. If this doesn't get settled quickly and the Strait of Hormuz does not open up, the Gulf countries from Qatar to the UAE to Kuwait are all going to face really heightened food prices because right now a huge reconfiguration of supply chains is going on where Saudi port of Jeddah and then Omani ports on the Indian Ocean are now receiving food supplies for the Gulf states. But that's a monumental task to kind of to change these supply chains around. So experts and analysts are warning that if Hormuz doesn't open up, we could see food inflation spike in the Gulf states, particularly countries like the UAE, which are geared towards expats and foreigners. City states like Dubai, they rely massively on imported foodstuffs. So that is one impact that's happening right now, and Iran doesn't even need to strike again. Just the Strait of Hormuz's closure is doing that. I think we've also seen the Iranians make some warnings about hitting financial institutions linked to the West, and then also AI and data infrastructure. Remember, Matilda, as you said, the Gulf states had courted Trump very heavily last year. When Trump made his visit to the Gulf region in May, he went to the UAE, he went to Qatar, and he went to Saudi Arabia. And the main topic of conversation was building AI data centers. And the UAE and Saudi Arabia, especially, they just sealed deals to buy, the most expensive NVIDIA AI chips that they could get their hands on. And they have these, data center ambitions, which the Iranians very clearly could strike and hit. So that's another escalation that they have. So far, the Iranians have not done that. We should be very clear. They are really, they are mapping out the escalation ladder very, very clearly. But that is a risk, right? So AI data centers, and then also financial institutions.
Sean Matthews, thank you. That's been incredibly insightful as always. We really appreciate your time.